What's going on? Today I want to talk about 7 things you should know before you decide to purchase the brand new Sony ZV-E10 Mark II. Now, some of these are good things, some of these are not so good, but I think all of them you should definitely know at least before you buy this camera. Now, like always, I'm not going to waste your time. I'm going to jump right into this video, but if it does help you out, please consider dropping a like and subscribing to my channel. Alright, number 1, this is mostly going to affect you if you're upgrading from an older APS-C Sony camera, like the a6000, a6400, a6500, or even the original Sony ZV-E10 Mark I. So the ZV-E10 II now uses Sony's bigger FZ100 batteries that typically are just in Sony's higher end or their full frame cameras, but now they added their bigger batteries into the ZV-E10 Mark II instead of the smaller FW50 batteries. And so this means you're getting a lot better battery life, you're getting a bigger grip in this camera to, be able to fit these bigger batteries. But it also means if you're upgrading from an older APS-C Sony camera, like most of the other a6000 series cameras or the original ZV-E10, you're now gonna have to upgrade to these FZ100 batteries. Now that is a good thing because these are bigger, better, just newer batteries. But if you had a huge stack of the older batteries already, you're gonna have to get rid of those and buy new batteries for this camera. Alright, next up, the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II doesn't have any sort of electronic viewfinder. So what this means is no matter what, you have to use this 3-inch articulating screen on the back of the camera. Now this camera really does have a great screen. It's an upgrade from the original ZV-E10 Mark I. It's a fully articulating 3-inch touchscreen. However, if you do a lot of photography, not having an EVF is going to be sort of limiting, especially outdoors in bright conditions. A lot of times, even with the screen brightness all the way up, it's just really difficult to see the screen and see what you're taking photos of. And so it's definitely something that you should think about before you decide to purchase this camera. There are other Sony cameras that have EVFs built in. If you want to spend a little bit more, you can go with the a6700, which has a lot of the internals of this camera, but it also does have that built-in EVF, and it's going to be a slightly more expensive camera. So just something to keep in mind, Sony did decide to leave out the EVF on this camera in order to be able to fit in other specs at this price point and keep it as small as possible. Alright, next up, this is kind of a small thing, but definitely something you should know before you buy this, especially if this is going to be your first ever camera. In the box, when you buy this camera, there is no charger and no USB-C cable or anything like that included. Just the camera and the battery itself. So legitimately out of the box, there is no way to charge this camera. Now, most people at least have a USB-C cable laying around that you can charge this camera with. But if you legitimately don't have a USB-C cable and don't have an FZ100 battery charger, straight out of the box, there is no way to charge this camera. I think that's really weird. And it seriously would have cost Sony, what, a couple dollars to add a simple USB-C cable? But I can guarantee there will be some people that buy this and just not have a way to charge it and have to go out and buy something separate, which is just kind of weird. You're buying a $1,000 camera from Sony and it doesn't have any way to charge it. Either way, I'm not going to be stuck on this for too much longer. Let's move on to the next one. Alright, next up, because of the frame rates, the codecs, the resolutions that this camera can film in order to be able to record the highest quality video out of this camera and just get overall the best specs, you're gonna need a UHS 2 SD card. So again, this is something that if you have an older Sony camera, like an a6000, a6400, or even the original ZV-E10, with those cameras, you could get away with pretty much using any SD card. However, with this camera, because it records 4K 10-bit 422 video at really high bit rates, you're specifically gonna need a UHS 2 SD card to get the most quality out of this camera. Otherwise, you're going to be slightly limited in terms of the resolutions and frame rates that you can record in. Now, again, like all of these, this isn't a super big deal, but it is something that you should probably know just in case you need to spend a little bit extra on a new SD card. If you want to record something like 4K 60 FPS in XAVC-SI, which is the highest quality format this camera can record. Alright, next up, going off of the recording resolution and specs, if you decide to record in 4K 60 FPS, there will be a slight crop in on this sensor. I think it's around a 1.1x crop, so it's not very substantial, but you just won't be able to get quite as wide of footage as you would in something like 4K 24 or 30 frames per second. Alright, next up, this is something that isn't in any of the specs or the marketing terms or anything for this camera. But since the ZV-E10 II shares the exact same sensor and a lot of the same internals as its bigger brothers, the FX30 and the a6700, this camera actually has dual base ISOs of 800 and 2500 when you're recording video in S-Log3. And so the base ISO of a camera is essentially where you're going to get the cleanest, best looking image with the least amount of noise and grain. And typically the base ISO is pretty low in terms of the ISOs that you can choose from in a camera. So for example, in this camera, 800 ISO is one of the base ISOs. Now, once you start to increase your ISO from that base ISO, you're gonna add in noise, you're gonna add in grain, and in general just lower the quality of your image. But when it comes to cameras that have dual base ISOs like the ZV-E10 II, once you increase your ISO up to that second base ISO of 2500, it's actually gonna clean your image back up like it would at, ISO 800. And it essentially just resets back to a point with a super clean image where then you can bump up from 2500 even higher, and it'll start to add more noise and grain from there. Now, if you don't have any prior knowledge to dual base ISOs, it can be kind of confusing, but essentially what this means is with this camera, you're getting really good low light and really good high ISO noise performance while you're recording video in S-Log3, which is pretty much just gonna allow you to get much cleaner footage than you would with a camera that doesn't have dual base ISOs. Alright, now last but not least, this camera does not have IBIS built in. Now it does have stabilization, but it's not IBIS or internal in-body stabilization where the sensor itself shifts around to stabilize your footage. And so basically what this means is with no stabilization, your footage is going to be slightly shaky, especially if your lens doesn't have stabilization either. And then if you decide to turn stabilization on in this camera, it's going to crop in a decent amount on your footage, which might slightly hurt you when it comes to vlogging, where you typically want a really wide angle footage, but you also typically want stabilization for vlogging. So it does make it a little bit difficult if you don't have a super wide lens like, the Sony 11mm or 15mm lenses. And where this gets even worse is if you record in 4K 60 FPS too, with stabilization, it's gonna crop in a little bit with 4K 60 and then even more when you turn on the stabilization in this camera. Alright, that was a pretty quick one, but I hope it did help you out. Like I said, please consider dropping a like and subscribing if it did. And also let me know down in the comments if you want to see more content about the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II. But that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.